All right. By the time the Fancher party entered Utah, their appointment with a brutal death under wide open spaces was simply a matter of time. Upon their arrival in Salt Lake City, which they think was around August 3rd, 1857, the journal of an LDS member, Lorenzo Brown, noted that, quote, the bishop of their ward requested to take charge of all the property of the ward, so there would be no selling to the Gentiles, end quote. Where Jesus said in Mark 9, for whosoever shall give a cup of water to drink in my name shall not lose his reward. Brigham's orders were that no Latter-day Saint was to give or sell any immigrant anything they might need. To disobey this meant a stark and vicious, often, reprisal. LDS author Will Bagley notes that stepping into Salt Lake City was like, quote, stepping into a hornet's nest, as the previous week the leaders had worked the LDS followers into a religious frenzy. Bagley adds in his book, Blood of the Prophets, quote, even a historian sympathetic to the Mormons reported that the Arkansans found in the Mormons no friendly mood and at once concluded to break camp out of Salt Lake City and move on. And what did the Fancher party most likely face as they rode south out of Salt Lake City toward their destiny with death? The same treatment that other parties of immigrants faced who came before them but lived to report it. Often wagon trains were aggressively met by Mormons who would first inquire, are you a saint or are you a sinner? Meaning, are you a Latter-day Saint or are you not one of us? And it would be a very difficult ride for them if they said sinner. This included a system of fines and fees imposed upon immigrant trains, which in the end was just merely a guise for extortion. Fines were imposed if a cow or a cattle grazed on some land that was supposedly unauthorized, if profanity was used in any way, shape, or form, and fines were imposed for fault finding of the LDS leaders for imposing the fines. Property would be held if protest was made in response. In addition to the rule of not selling to the immigrants, even the necessities of life and finding them for all matter of unconscionable causes, immigrant trains were also under the constant fear of the Indians. Now, Bagley and Juanita Brooks provide a large body of research on the different Indian tribes living in Utah when it was a territory, and there's so much of it, I can't do it justice. I can't even really begin to try to report it to you. But know this. The federal government, as like a bone to Brigham Young, made him the territorial agent to the Indian people in this territory. And with this position, he became, in their eyes, a big chief. A man that they called Bigun. That's what they called him, Bigun. Brigham Young, amidst his rhetoric that the last days of the earth were quickly approaching and that the Gentile nation was going to fall, he tapped into Joseph Smith's war prophecy that's found in the Doctrine and Covenants, which states, quote, that the remnant, talking about the American Indians, who are left in the land shall marshal themselves and shall become exceedingly angry and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation. In other words, to translate the Doctrine and Covenants, what Joseph Smith prophesied was the Indians are going to get really ugly and savage-like, and they're going to plague upon the Gentiles of the nation. To help marshal the Utah tribes, Brigham was strategically good to the Indian peoples and provided them with a great amount of material blessings. But for this support, he exacted a price. That is, the Utah natives were taught not only to differentiate between the Maricats, those are the Americans, and the Mormons, but to be hostile to the one and subservient to the other. This symbiotic relationship allowed for the Mormons in many ways to use and control the natives in order to take advantage and capitalize on the Maricats who sought passage through the Utah territory. Says Bagley, quote, Young had to choose between his fidelity to the U.S. government and his loyalty to the Mormon people. The superintendent for Indian affairs for the Utah Territory was charged with protecting overland immigrants from Indian attacks. And on August 16th of 1857, Brigham Young declared that he would abandon that responsibility if the army came into Utah, end quote. However, Brigham Young didn't wait for the U.S. invasion in order to sic the Indians on travelers. With the Fancher Party in the territory, Young, according to Bagley, listen to this, quote, explicitly violated his sworn duty and sent his agents to encourage Indian attacks on wagon trains. These agents met with the Indian leaders and after supplying them with melons and cows and corn, told them that, quote, the Lord had come out of his hiding place and they, the Indians, had to commence their work, end quote. In the end, when the Indians didn't finish certain jobs expected of them, the Mormons assumed their savage appearances and finished the jobs off themselves. Immigrant witnesses from other trains often commented on the unique skin color of the Indians in Utah, observing that when being raided and robbed by these savages, deep white lines in the creases of skin around their eyes was seen, and white patches between their ears and their hair. In other words, the Mormons were accustomed to dressing up as natives and doing evil, then letting the blame fall upon their Lamanite brothers. So the Fancher Party got out of Salt Lake and headed south as quickly as possible, and they approached Cedar City, and two events of many are worth reciting quickly. First of all, it's strongly believed that the Fancher Party allowed some backouts to join their group, and this would have infuriated the Mormon people. You see, Brigham Young revived Joseph Smith's law of consecration and 3 years earlier in the territory, and there was a lot of Latter-day Saints who said, we are tired of being under this domination of Brigham Young, and he collects everything we own in this law of consecration. We want out of here. And so they would seek a safe way to get out of town, and they were known as backouts. Okay? So these guys, they believe some of them had joined up with the Fancher Party to go to California. Additionally, there's a story which LDS author Bagley says is a pure myth that surfaced that said the Fancher Party, when they had stopped at an Indian farm near Fillmore called Corn Creek, that they poisoned the well water there and ox meat, which led to the deaths of several Indians. By all accounts, these stories were fabrications forged and forwarded by the LDS to cover and or somehow justify the deeds they authored and committed. We can say this because where all the accusations against the Fancher Party are not documented, and if they are written down, they were written down at least 10 to 15 years after they were murdered, okay? After they were murdered. The other accounts that were written when the Fancher Party was actually in Utah traveling through were all reliable and very good. As a matter of record, that summer, an LDS man named Eli Kelsey was returning from his LDS mission and traveled with the Fancher train to Fort Bridger and then to Salt Lake City. This LDS returned missionary who was with the Fancher Party wrote, he had never traveled with more pleasant companions, and spoke kindly about sharing company with the Fancher Party's venerable patriarch, that would be the head of it. The returned missionary also noted that the Fancher Party were, quote, people from the country districts, sober, hardworking, plain folks, but well-to-do, and taken all in all about as respectable a band of immigrants as ever passed through Salt Lake City, end quote. Let me just summarize that as the Fancher train made its way down to Cedar City, Brigham had met with many of the territorial Indian chiefs to engage them in the work of keeping immigrants off the Utah Territory roads and lands. All the factors we have discussed over the past 3 or 4 weeks now were reaching a fervent pitch. Bagley, a historian who has researched the evidence more than any human alive, wrote, quote, whatever led to their massacre, one thing is certain. The attack was set in motion days before the Fancher Party reached Cedar City. And Juanita Brooks, another LDS author on the subject, wrote, quote, "When the facts are marshaled, there is not justification enough for the death of a single individual." These are very important statements because prior to and immediately following the Mormon bloodbath, all sorts of mythical justifications came out of the woodwork to justify their actions. The big question that remains is, where did the orders come from to carry the massacre out? We cannot read a declaration from Brigham Young that says, kill them. But I believe the answer is so obvious. Just ask yourselves, where do Latter-day Saints today get the authorization to act in the name of the church? Who ordered the Prop 8 involvement, for example? Who tells Mormon girls that they are allowed to have one piercing per ear in this day and age? Whose signature is found at the bottom of the letter that the missionaries get to go on a mission? That's right. It's their so-called modern-day prophet. Then, perhaps more importantly, and with this in mind, ask yourself this. At what point in all of Mormon history was there a time when the LDS Mormon prophet would have been in most control and would have overseen almost everything that went on around him? What point in time was that? It was when Brigham Young was in office. So we can just look at today and see how the prophet still manages the Mormon church, and he lets out how things are supposed to be. Can you imagine what it would have been like under Brigham Young? They said that they had a communication system from Salt Lake all the way to the south end, to the north end, to east and west here in Utah that was faster than a wire telegraph. They could get it from their guys on exactly what needed to happen. So aside from the factors we've discussed, which all came from Brigham Young anyway, how did the order to kill the Fancher party reach the Mormon leaders in southern Utah? While the Fancher party headed south toward Mountain Meadows, they crossed paths with the rotund apostle of the church, George A. Smith, who had been in southern Utah on church affairs, which included repeating Young's directive that they were not to sell anything to the immigrants. So as Apostle Smith is coming up from Cedar City, the Fancher party is leaving Salt Lake, and they cross paths. And as a matter of fact, it so happened that they actually camped within yards of each other one night as they were headed their different directions. And a witness in Apostle Smith's camp wrote this. He said that Apostle Smith said in their camp, looking over at the Fanchers, he believed that there was a strange atmosphere surrounding the travelers and that, quote, some evil would befall them before they got through the territory. Bagley writes that Smith pronounced a self-fulfilling prophecy with those words toward Mountain Meadows. After Apostle Smith reached So daytime comes, Apostle Smith and his entourage go north towards Salt Lake. The Fancher party heads south, and two guys, they were Silas Smith and Bishop Seymour Brunson. They turned around from being with the Apostle Smith's party, and they rode back south, outdid the Fancher party, and got to Cedar City and other places before them. Bagley notes that federal prosecutors believe that these two saints carried the orders with them that the veterans of the massacre called the orders from headquarters. Now, without getting bogged down in a plethora of LDS names and who participated in the actual bloodletting, let me just say the word was out and obedience to it was expected to all who were invited to participate. By the time the Fancher party reached Cedar City, Bagley says the fire of religious reformation burned brightly. I would imagine a similar fervor was present during the Crusades and in the cockpit of those planes that took out our two World Trade Centers, and in Waco and in Jonestown. Nothing, not even nationalism, can get people to do more evil than people who do evil in the name of God or a holy purpose. But with this being said, I don't want to end tonight because next week we're going to Mountain Meadows to tell you what happened. I want to end tonight on a note that is positive. It actually gives me hope. It's two stories that I applaud. Both are about LDS people. The first is about Mrs. Morgan in Cedar City. She was a devout Mormon woman who, despite the cruel orders from the top not to trade with the immigrants at all, she gave them a round of cheese for their journey in trade for one of their handmade blankets from Arkansas. Bagley notes that Brother and Sister Morgan were cut off from the church later on. The second story of honor is about an LDS man named Joseph Walker. Cedar City, as was mentioned, was on fire with religious fervor, the kind that leads to bloodshed. Bagley states, however, that, quote, listen to this, Mormons of conscience resisted the hysteria. Where Mormon hostility had blasted the Arkansas train since Salt Lake City, the Fancher team made a friend with Joseph Walker, who Bagley described as a sturdy and bluff old Englishman, who charitably took the grain the Fancher party had bought at Corn Creek, and he milled it for them on their journey. His bishop, a guy named Bishop Philip Klingensmith, who was a real piece of bloody, murderous work, sent an elder and ordered Walker to not grind that wheat up. Walker replied in the record from the book, from Bagley, quote, tell the bishop I have 6 grown sons, and that we will sell our lives at the price of death to others before I will obey his orders, end quote. That is honor, my friends. Honor, I am sure, was forged on a true anvil of Jesus Christ. Old Walker, amidst wild fanaticism, told his bishop, who was supposedly inspired by the Lord, to take a flying leap. I hope more Latter-day Saints will do the same. Stand up and say no more praise to the man. No more believing in this pearl of great price. No more going on and on and on because you say we should. It takes courage to do that. These people's lives were at stake and they stood up to it. You can stand up to it too. No matter what the cost appears to be, you can stand up to it too. Because it takes the same type of courage. Where Joseph Walker and the Morgan couple said, we're not going to listen, we're going to do what's right. The others went on and murdered people in cold blood. How long will you obey because the brethren tell you to do it? Look at the manual. Go to that. The Fancher party got out of Cedar City unawares that men, LDS leaders, had gathered in prayer to ask the Spirit on how to go about killing them. Next week, we'll arrive at the scene of the Mountain Meadows Massacre.